Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm so excited. This is the first time we're presenting this particular topic, 21st century teens. So really glad that you can be with us. Thank you very much to the Hatboro-Horsham Educational Foundation for funding this program, and to the Hatboro-Horsham School District for hosting us. We have been in a very serious relationship with Hatboro-Horsham for almost 12 years now. In fact, this is where Be a Part of the Conversation got started almost 12 years ago in May. It was our anniversary coming up. So it's great to be in our home territory, even though we're on Zoom. So welcome to everyone in Hatboro-Horsham and outside of Hatboro-Horsham. So let's dive into this topic. I'm going to just start us off with a little bit of background just to sort of tee things up for Liz to talk with you. There are so many challenges. We know you can't watch the news and not realize that adolescents are struggling these days. There's so much anxiety and stress, and they are looking for ways to relieve some of that stress and anxiety. And I want to start by putting this word right out there. And I'm wondering what you all think about when you see this word, like what comes to mind. It's a kind of a loaded word, but I want us to lean into it and really think about what this really means. And we're very cautious in this field to talk about things that aren't stigmatizing and aren't challenging. And there are a lot of ways to talk about addiction without using this word, but I think that it's an important word because substance use disorder is something that is clinically used quite often to talk about someone addicted to substances who has a chronic relapsing brain disease because they're consistently seeking a substance, something mood altering, that helps them feel better in the moment, but it's now become a compulsion, but they're continuing to use it despite harmful consequences. That to me is the most basic definition of addiction: continued use, continued behavior, despite negative or harmful consequences. And the reason it's considered a brain disorder is because of the way drugs react in the brain. This is kind of a next level behavioral addiction, right? This is a substance, so it's actually chemically changing our brain. But there are a lot of other things that we can become addicted to. That's why I don't like to just use the term substance use disorder, because there are other things that we can do, like process addictions, behavioral addictions. And these are forms of addiction that involve a compulsion to engage in a rewarding, non-drug related behavior, despite, again, those negative consequences. So if you or I are watching Netflix, which sometimes I do, on a loop all day long, not moving out of your room, not getting dressed, not going out, and we can talk more about gaming and other things. But if that use is making your lives unmanageable, that might be a behavioral process addiction that we have. So just starting with the substances, because that is very much what young people still turn to. Alcohol is still the most used substance by adolescents and young adults. So looking at 12th graders, this is from the National Survey Monitoring the Future, 46.5% are using alcohol, and roughly 30% are vaping or vaping cannabis. And so there's a lot of nuance to this. Are they vaping nicotine? Are they vaping THC? Is it a combination? Are there other oils and things that they're vaping? But they're vaping. At least a third of them are. And so not all of them are, but certainly more than we would like. So that's where we're looking at substance use. That's the most common among adolescents. Prescription substances are not misused terribly. I mean, it's coming down, it's getting better, but about 5% of 12 to 17-year-olds have misused prescriptions in a year's time. But this is another little piece of information about 12th graders looking at the kind of substances that they use. So an opioid like Vicodin is the most frequently used. And then you see amphetamines. This is something that I think is a great concern because we know that this use escalates after the age of 18. So those 18 to 25-year-olds, college years, the study drug, and some others, but not quite as, in general, these are not quite as commonly used as they were even 5 or 10 years ago, and not as commonly used as alcohol or cannabis. But taking a look at some of the process addictions, the behavior addictions, number one is technology. I think that I'm sure a lot of the advanced questions we had were about this, and we actually have other programs that focus specifically on this. One of them, our good friend Mike Blanche does a talk called Kids and the Tech Life Balance. and that's recorded on our YouTube channel where we take a really deep dive into this. But it's really important to look at some of this. So Common Sense Media is a great resource for looking at these things. They did some surveys and found that 50% of teenagers believe they are addicted to their phones. We also know that 26% of all car accidents in the United States happen as a result of smartphone use. That's alarming. This is not broken down by adolescents versus adults, young drivers versus mature drivers. But this is a really alarming figure. And taking a look at different social media outlets. So social media is a big one, obviously. And you can see that this is comparing the year 14-15 to last year. And TikTok was not on their radar back in 2014, 2015, but wow, has this become really ubiquitous among young people? YouTube is number one right now. This is at 95% of teenagers, 13 to 17, are using these different platforms. And then you can see Instagram is pretty high up, but that's really climbing. Snapchat is climbing. No surprise, Facebook's coming down in this age group. This is probably more my generation that's on Facebook, probably why the kids aren't on there. Twitter is coming down and Tumblr is coming down. And then these are all kind of newer ones that don't have that earlier data. 20% of 12 to 15-year-olds are saying that they almost always log in at night to respond to messages. 12 to 15-year-olds reading comments, checking for post likes. We often talk about that developing brain, the prefrontal cortex that's not fully developed until we're 25 years old. The younger we are and we begin behaviors that can present problems, the bigger the challenge. So we really want to be paying attention to this and how we can work with our kids to moderate their behavior. 12% of teen boys, and now this study didn't show across genders, but just looking at teen boys, have reported being addicted to video games. Probably not too surprising to many of you parents out there. Gambling is so interesting because the legal age of gambling ranges depending on the state. So in Pennsylvania, depending on what you want to play or where you want to play it, you either need to be 18 or 21. In PA, land-based casinos require that you're 21, but if you're betting on horses at something called a racino, which is, I've never heard that term before until I just looked it up today. That means a racetrack that also has casino games. You only have to be 18. And then, of course, there's online gambling, sports betting, and scratch-offs. You only have to be 18 for scratch-offs. But online, I don't even know what's in place to help protect that other than yes, I'm over 21 or whatever that might be. But that's a real concern. And we can see that 18 to 21-year-olds high school students have reported 60 to 80% of them have reported gambling in the past year for money, and 4 to 6% of high schoolers are considered to be addicted to gambling. That might sound like a low number, but it's really concerning, I think, and that's just self-reporting. That's just what we know of, what we're learning about. How many are flying under the radar until it really becomes problematic. Looking at food and eating disorders, so food addiction, right? This is looking at anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorders for those aged 13 to 18 years old. Overall, 2.7% are reported as having an eating disorder. Breaking that down with females versus males, you can see the discrepancy there. And then the age levels, you can see that it does rise throughout those years. So, that's a lot of information about, kind of some of the different behavioral addictions. And I just like to point out for parents that there's a lot we can do. And I know Liz will talk with you more about this. And I think we can have a conversation about this as we go through the evening. But something that we can do as parents that we often talk about, and it's really not lost on me in this topic especially, is modeling. We are the most important influencers in our children's lives. There are lots of influencers out there on TikTok and things, but we're influencers too. They don't always act like we're influencing them, but they're watching us. They may not listen to us, but they're watching us. They see what we do. So if we show them, if we say to them, I am so sick of looking at this and my laptop. I'm going to go outside and take a walk. Do you want to come with me? Let's go get some fresh air. Okay. That's a beautiful lesson in ways to deal with stress, make sure that we're moderating our behaviors, our own behaviors, because the reality is, there are plenty of us adults who are struggling with a lot of these same behavioral addictions ourselves, or being somewhere on that spectrum. And so showing that we're going to manage that and moderate it in a healthy way, is a really great idea. And, I think that when we talk about that impulsivity that a young person might have to just feel better now, reach for the phone, reach for the food, go gamble, whatever that might be, pick up a drink or a drug. That is about pleasure. That is about instant satisfaction, instant gratification. And instead, we really should be thinking about our long-term meaningful happiness, how we deal with pain. We're not going to make our pain go away by doing this. We're just going to mask it and delay our paying attention to it. And I really like what Bruce Perry says. Bruce Perry is a pediatrician. He co-authored that book with Oprah Winfrey that you might have heard about a few years ago. But he says, wouldn't it be great if all of our behaviors were respectful of our biology, like what our body needs? Our body does not need to be sitting in one spot for hours on end playing a video game. So let's talk some more about all this. But I'm going to first now introduce you to Liz Ferris. Liz is a licensed social worker and certified alcohol and drug counselor. She spent the past few years working with adolescents and young adults with co-occurring mental health and substance use at the intensive outpatient level of care. Liz believes in engaging entire family in treatment as well as prevention. She believes in the education of individuals and family, as well as the strengths-based approach in challenging individuals to go beyond presenting issues through exploring relationships and family systems to create a more comprehensive awareness and understanding of self. So take it away, Liz. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz. So yeah, I'm going to go through and just kind of define a little bit in more detail just some of the process addictions that I'm seeing these high school kids working with. Kim laid down a really good base, and I'll just go into a little bit more detail. So in terms of defining what addiction is, right, it's the idea that you're continuing to engage in some kind of activity despite the negative consequences, right? So if something is hurting me, but I'm still continuing to engage in it. And when I work with kids, right, it's not necessarily how much time they're engaging in this thing, right? It's like, kids will be like, oh, well, like I only do this on the weekends, or I only did this once or twice, right? But for me, what I'm looking at is it's much more about how it's interfering with the individual's life, right? The individual's ability to be able to get their obligations met. So it looks like, are you stepping back from things that you care about? Are you withdrawing from things that are important? So not getting your schoolwork done, not playing on your sports teams anymore, not answering your friends, things along those lines, affecting the ability to get those kinds of things done. And the idea of process addictions is that it's not necessarily about a substance. It's about a ritual or a behavior that develops over time in order to be able to quell some kind of anxiety or underlying mental health feature. So some of the main process addictions that I'm seeing kids coming in with, I know a lot of the questions that came in before tonight were a lot about technology, right? I think somebody wrote in here, my kid's addicted to their phone, right? And that's what's happening, right? So it's gaming, it's social media, it's screen time in general. It leads to like pornography addiction, social media, it leads to body image issues, which leads to exercise addiction and different kinds of eating disorders and food addiction, like Kim was talking about. Technology is something that has come into our lives and it's not going anywhere. So we really need to figure out how to integrate it successfully and healthily into our lives. But the idea that, we have 6% of high school kids accessing gambling, right, is a direct result of how easily accessible everything is because we have this technology. So the process addictions are harder to deal with in a lot of ways early on because it's not it's not the same as a substance, right? So like when I'm working with kids that are struggling with substance use with alcohol or marijuana or something like that, it's really easy to draw a clear line, right? The answer is abstinence, right? No more alcohol, no more pot. We're going to stop smoking nicotine, right? But in terms of looking at the process addictions, where we get into the weeds is that a lot of these things are things that we're going to interact with for the rest of our lives, right? We want to work out to be healthy. We will need to go shopping. We want to be in healthy relationships. We're going to need to use our phones, right? And so being able to work with kids to kind of create outlines of what is healthy behavior and interaction, what is kind of more of a risky behavior, right? Where we kind of catching ourselves going down the rabbit hole, and then defining really clearly are what is like out and out not acceptable and not okay, and a clear indicator that we're in a lot of trouble. So that's usually how, when I'm starting to work with kids, I'm looking at to get a better perspective of what their actual interactions with the phone is, right? Because our kid, like all of these kids are on their phones all the time. And so then deeper into that, right, we look at what the triggers are, right? So there's internal and external triggers, right? So there's the internal triggers are more so like, how am I feeling about myself? What's going on with me internally, right? We talk about HALT a lot and those different acronyms, right? Like hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Am I stressed? Am I isolated? Things along those lines. And then also looking at like external triggers that all of these kids are experiencing every day, right? From being in school where vaping and smoking pot like through carts is really accessible, right? These kids are going into school, this is happening. Schools, all these kids have different like social media, like they have like Instagram pages and Snapchats, like secret ones for their schools where they're like posting things about different people that they all kind of know about, and some of the stuff on there can be really damaging. And it's also something where kids want to feel and be able to be a part of, right? So finding, how am I doing this, but how is it affecting me and my mental health and how I'm feeling internally, and what my view is with the rest of the world, and how I see myself based on how I'm engaging with this stuff. And so some of the main things, right, when we're looking at process addiction and some things, I have some specific questions that I can run through, but really when we're looking at, is my kid on the phone too much? Is he playing video games because that's the way that he's able to connect with his friends after school, right? Like sometimes in the suburbs, it's like you can't like ride your bike down the block to like hang out with your friends. And so they're on video, they're playing their video games, engaging in that kind of way and communicating, or on the phone communicating, right? Which can be a positive thing. But then looking at their preoccupation with it, right? How much time am I spending on this? How is it impacting my communication, my ability to engage in my family, my friends, things along those lines? The withdrawal piece, right? So we talk about withdrawal from like substances, but there's also withdrawal that happens from these process addictions, right? So an example of that is when your kids played video games for like 8 hours and you're like, all right, you got to come up and have dinner, right? And they're angry, right? They don't want to disengage. They want to continue playing. The idea that they have to eat dinner is bothersome to them. The idea that they have to interact with you guys is challenging, because it's something that is taking them away from this one piece that is becoming more important in their lives. Another piece is how tolerance goes up, right? So again, like in terms of gambling, the idea of people who used to like, like you're making a few like stupid bets on FanDuel Sports or something like that, and you're betting like 10, 20, $30, right? But then after a while, as you continue to do that, you need to be betting more money in order to be getting the same responses, right? So watching that tolerance going up. Another huge piece is the inability to reduce that use, right? The inability to stop, right? Identifying, hey, this might be getting a little out of hand, or saying, yeah, mom, like I'll leave my phone in my bedroom when we eat dinner, or yeah, I'll be up in like 20 minutes. and I'll put the game down for the rest of the night, and then not being able to do that, right? Continuing to go back to it, giving up other activities and things that we care about despite negative consequences. Lying is a huge piece of this, right? Really, when we minimize what's going on, right? So Mike always talks about how it's really easy to look at all the stats on your phone, right? Like, how long have you been on your phone today? How many hours did you spend on Instagram? And kind of looking at that, right? And so when a kid will be like, oh yeah, I'm only on Instagram or TikTok for like 2 or 3 hours a day. And then we pull it out and it's like closer to like 8 or 9, right? And it's like, how are we doing this when we're also in school and trying to sleep? And really being able to get a much clearer picture with them of what is actually going on. And then again, right, with addiction in general, and process addictions and behaviors is the same way. We're using these behaviors to try to regulate our emotions, right? So something is going on internally with us, and we're not able to or we for some reason don't have like the proper coping skills to be able to kind of work through this. And so we're looking for these things to be able to help regulate, right? It either is setting off some dopamine, we're getting a little high off of it, we're feeling better, but it's something that doesn't last long, and then it makes us keep going back to it, right? Playing the video games was a really good distraction. Being on the phone was a really good distraction, right? Buying all of this stuff got me really excited, right? But then this stuff comes and we lose the excitement over it, and we need to go back and do more, right? So it's continuously like building off of that. And so just, the questions are like spending how much time are they spending with this stuff in comparison to other activities? What is the performance in school looking like? What are their ways, your kids' ways of dealing with difficult emotions, right? Are we avoiding our emotions? Are we able to talk about them? Are we having communication in the house about what's going on, or are we shutting down, right? Noticing how they're spending their time, relationships with friends, some of, all of these things. Some of the stuff is repetitive. All right. And so then the big thing for me when I'm working with adolescents, right? It's like, so over at Ethos, we have all the adult programs are split. It's either mental health or substance use. And for me and the adolescent therapists, we really do like a comorbid group, because often what's happening when these kids are coming in with substance abuse or any kind of process addiction, it is like very clearly tied to some kind of underlying mental health piece. So when we're working with kids that are addicted to the gaming, addicted to their phones, addicted to vaping, whatever it might be, that is usually the thing that we see first, right? We look at the symptoms. It's like, oh my gosh, my kid is doing this, or this is what's going on, right? Those are like the indicators that something's going wrong for them. And so it's usually the thing that kind of starts to bring them in. But really what ends up happening for us when we're doing this work with them is that we need to disengage them from whatever behavior they're using. And then once we're able to separate them from that piece, then is when we can actually start to assess what the mental health piece really looks like, and really start to work on that with them. And so when we're looking at the adolescents, right, it's like they're looking at these things, and it's like you parents are like, oh my God, my kid is on the phone all the time, they're addicted to this is terrible, right? And it's like for these high school kids that are coming into me, like this is their answer, right? Like this is the thing that's helping them. And so being able to help kind of start explaining to them this, like the neuroscience behind all of these things, because these process addictions help numb, right? It helps them avoid whatever distressing feelings they're having. And when kids are this young and showing themselves using these kinds of behaviors as ways to deal with stressors, right, it is a really clear indicator that things are going to continue to go off the tracks as they get older if they're not caught now. So it doesn't necessarily start off as addiction, but as we continue to use these behaviors, it starts to create these clearer pathways for us where that is the direction that these kids go in, right? And some kids are more vulnerable than others, right? We talk about it Kim talks about it a lot in all these programs, right? There's social, there's environmental, there's your biology, your family history, all of these different things, your own mental health history that's coming into it. And so, and also, when kids are this young, right, their brains aren't fully developed. And so they're at a much higher risk of becoming susceptible to this stuff. The last piece of it is when we're talking about these process addictions early on, before kids get exposed to substances, their bodies are the first thing that they have access to, right? So this is why we need to pay such close attention to what's going on with them at this age, because before they're having access to nicotine, to pot, to alcohol, they have access to their body, right? So they have access to eating, right? Restricting their eating, overeating, ways to try and self-regulate their bodies through starvation or bulimia, right? When you're throwing up, your nervous system is regulating itself. Self-harm, masturbation, all of these different things that are ways that kids are just learning how to regulate themselves, and then being given this technology piece, being able to have so much more access, it continues to dig into a deeper hole. And so then what also happens from this is we start to have some of the process addictions will then also replicate in our brains the same way that certain drugs are registered, right? So we talk about, like the LED lights and kids being on video games can kind of like replicate itself in your brain the same way that cocaine does, right? So it's like when you're playing video games and then all of a sudden it's like 8 hours later and you haven't slept, or you've been on TikTok scrolling through it all night. So things like that start to kind of like create these pathways in your brain so that you can become more and more susceptible to it as you continue to grow up. And then that's where cross addictions come in, right? So cross addictions are usually when we start off with one thing, but eventually we are no longer getting the same effect from it, right? So it's like when I'm talking about going from betting like $30 to $100, right? It's like we keep upping the ante, trying to get that same result. But we're not able to get it in the same way, or it's starting to affect us, right? It's starting to negatively affect us. We're starting to feel the consequences. It's something that is not producing the same effect that we were hoping that it would, or that it used to. So then we'll try to start to find similar things to recreate that feeling. And so there's different things that kind of like fall into that, right? Like gambling and then cocaine, right? Very similar. Being able to kind of up the ante in those kinds of ways. We talk about whack-a-mole all the time. So the idea of, it's like, we see all these different symptoms, but the bottom line is that the underlying piece is the mental health piece that we have to work on, right? It's like, we will kind of like reach for anything that we can to try to self-soothe. All right, let me see. Yeah, and so then I put a little bit more in here about tech, just because, again, it seemed like that was a lot of the questions that were coming in, right? And the idea is that, technology is here, right? It's not going anywhere. We are, like we're using it right now. This is something that is ingrained in our lives. And so the idea of completely shutting it down is something that is not realistic, right? Which again, is like the whole point with process addiction. So we're looking at how we're able to start integrating it safely into our lives, right? So a lot of the things that are going on in social media is causing the body image, causing porn addiction, right? We're seeing a lot more violence in early on sexual experiences with teenagers because of what they're being exposed to online. And looking at how it impacts your mental health, right? There's all these different studies and all of these different reportings that show that there's like years of like all of this data for video games that shows how to get kids like hooked into it more, showing that like Instagram really affects your body image, and that these websites know this and that they just don't care, and that they're able to continue feeding into it. you're ending up with higher levels of depression when you're on your phone as much as like when you're at your phone at a certain amount of time. And so for parents, right, it's like you guys have more access early on to your kids' phones, right? So monitoring it, having more conversations, being able to, look through it and see what's going on, and then working to have really open communication with them so that there can be a level of trust that starts to get built. Because as they get older, right, there's less access to it. So I work with parents that have, there's like 360 and track my iPhone so we can keep track of where all the kids are. But then there's also different apps that get downloaded where you can really monitor what is being texted and what is going on your kids' phones. You can put time blocks on it. You can restrict certain applications, different things like that, that can be really helpful as you're starting to integrate, your kid having phones, right? Because at first it was high school. Now it's like, these kids are getting phones earlier and earlier. So as we're educating them and teaching them on how to interact successfully with this phone, there are a lot of really supportive ways that you guys can help have open conversations and kind of help teach them safe ways to engage with it, right? In the same way that Kim was talking earlier about mirroring, right? Monitoring it, right? Like you being the example of how you're using your phone and things along those lines. Yeah. And so there's a lot of sleep issues and the higher risks of depression that are being reported based on how much the phone technology is being used. And so then in terms of treatment, there's a lot of different types of treatment out there. The DSM is slowly but surely acknowledging all of these different process addictions as they're putting it in there. I think it just was originally just gambling, but they're looking more and more at all these other things that are happening. There are a lot of inpatient and outpatient programs that deal with this stuff specifically. And then the important thing for you guys to know is just that some of these process addictions are very specific. And so making sure that you are getting therapists that know exactly what they're dealing with. I know that, I have kids that come into me having been in therapy for a long time, but a therapist doesn't necessarily deal with addiction as the primary thing. And so a lot of things can get missed. So just as you're building these concerns are starting to look for therapists for your kids, just making sure that that's something that whoever you guys are ending up with, like really know what they're talking about. And so then, yeah, the last pieces that I just wanted to talk about was just some things that you guys can do as parents in your homes, right? So while like technology is here, while all of these things are here and they're not going away, you guys as the parents still have say and control over what is going on in your house, right? You guys can set what that looks like. So you can negotiate what it looks like at home, whether it's doing things like no technology nights or game nights or dinners where like phones are not allowed. You can set really specific, clear boundaries and rules where phones get turned in at a certain time or the Wi-Fi goes off or all those different things. And the other piece is being able to like really listen to your kids, being able to have them feel like they're being heard, understanding what it is about these things that are really drawing them in. When we listen to them and give them space and validate how they're feeling and validating that this is like a big part of their life, it helps them kind of put their guard down and allow them to be able to have more of a conversation with you guys and also be able to hear that feedback better. So being able to learn all of those things can be really important. Another piece is, again, just to mention this, because this is something that I'm running into a lot with, not a lot, but like more than I used to is like monitoring the websites that your kids are going onto. Kim earlier showed the different stats and YouTube is like up at the top, right? And the algorithms that are on YouTube and the way that those websites work, right, it can really lead kids down some really dark rabbit holes unintentionally, right? Like your kids might not even really be aware of what's going on, but can find themselves, a couple months into like their algorithm in some really dark places on on the internet. And so being able to just, again, having like a non-judgmental conversation where you're able to kind of engage in seeing what's going on with them so that you guys can then step in and give them some more education. So educating them on, the idea that social media isn't real, right? It's like we're posting what we want you to think of us like, right? Not like what's actually going on in our lives all of the time. In the same way that like back in the day, like my parents used to talk to me about like how like cigarettes, like, like big tobacco was just like marketing to kids, right? And like I was getting used, right? Like it's the same thing with video games and technology and all of these different things. And then also talking about like, Mike talks about like digital integrity, right? Like how you're presenting yourself online. And the other big thing is like your digital footprint, right? So I work with kids that have gotten into a lot of trouble, that have gotten um in trouble with like cops because they've been at parties and the only way that the cops knew that they were there was because they were in the background of someone's like Snapchat, things like that, right? So being able to have conversations with your kids about all of those things can be really helpful. The last piece is like how and when to talk to your kids, right? If your kids are um always expecting you to be bringing these things up, they're going to be more shut down, right? So I usually suggest trying to do something along the lines of having, um, like a conversation like on Wednesday nights, right? Or there being like some kind of like specific designated time where you guys can sit down and have these conversations so that it isn't coming up in all different kinds of ways where you guys are getting stressed, they're getting stressed, and then the communication breaks down in that kind of way. Um, so that's like the basics of what I have. I know that there's a lot of questions that I can also get into and answer, but I can leave it at that for right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. That was really helpful. As you said, please, parents, don't be afraid to reach out to people like Liz. And Liz, I know there was one advanced question. Are you seeing new clients? I think that's a good question because I know you're all so busy. Are you seeing new clients right now?
I am. So I run an IOP Monday, Wednesday, Friday for high school kids. It's mental health and substance use. Um, so I have some availability, but usually my schedule is pretty tight after school hours, but we definitely have the group that kids are welcome to join.
Right. That's good to know. And I want to ask Dawn to chime in because, Dawn, if you can talk a lot about, student assistance programs and other services that you guys have, but also what you're seeing in the Hatboro-Horsham School District with regard to some of these kinds of things that Liz just described.
Speaker, okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, I've been trying to figure out the right speaker for my laptop here, so hopefully you can all hear me. So I work with Hatboro-Horsham K through 12 special services and oversee our student assistance program. We are seeing each and every one of the things that were listed tonight. None of them are new to us. We've seen them across the different age groups now. And I would say with the interaction of social media at the younger and younger ages, we're starting to see some of these behaviors and concern younger, but definitely gaming addictions, phones, just seeing students who, if they don't have access to their phones during the day, who are melting down, who are refusing to come to school or refusing to engage and follow, family expectations, not even making it in the door. There's there was a situation where a student dropped their phone and it got cracked and just had a meltdown, right? But at the end of the day, the phone still worked, but she couldn't even see. It's just the thought the phone was cracked in that moment just was a full-on meltdown and took her a long time to get back kind of engaged in that. And we're seeing that more and more. Gambling's definitely been something that has kind of made a resurgence here. And again, I think just that access to the social media sites and betting sites that they can see regularly. Vaping, that's certainly something that, like many other districts, we are having issues with. You can't monitor the children everywhere. They're having more and more access to things that we don't always know what they are. Is it tobacco? Is it nicotine? Is it marijuana? Is it something else? We do in our district take a stance that we do test any vapes that are found. So if a student is found in possession of a vape, we will test to see if it is nicotine, to see if it is THC, and depends if that's a policy violation. Is it a tobacco violation, or is it a drug policy violation? Which we try to use the violations in our district to be more of a, yes, there's a consequence for behaviors, but then how can we support? Connecting with some outside education, connecting with other resources. We all know the waiting lists have been really hard. So it's good to hear that you have some availability as well. Insurance is certainly playing a big part into some of the delays in families getting services and finding services that are meeting the needs. But we've definitely been talking more about the idea of this process addiction, of things that our students are going to have to learn to manage with, because it's part of our society. And I think, as you said that very nicely, where I can't just tell a kid that, okay, no, you don't have access to the internet, or you don't have access to gaming, because you have to form a relationship with it. And that's, I think, sometimes really challenging too for our families. I love this idea that you said, and I have not heard this one specifically, having conversations with our students and building that, but setting a time to talk so that it's something that is happening. That's a different idea than I've heard before. It's usually while you're driving in the car, where you're not, face to face, but setting that idea of knowing that, okay, here we have a set time to talk about expectations and teaching and modeling and social media or monitoring things, I think is a really interesting idea. It just would take something, you'd have to establish that with your family within your system. But I think it's really easy to kind of, what we'll see a lot is families will come forward with a concern, or a student will express a concern about their mental health, feeling, that they are not connecting, or that they're not feeling themselves and they're really struggling. And we deal with it kind of in the moment, and we're saying, all right, we're getting supports in. We're going to connect you with outside resources. And then the wait list happens, and then the conversation stops. And then everything seems okay. And that's what we're seeing, everything seems okay. And then we'll do a check-in with the student, and then if they're like, well, nobody at home's talking about it, it's not important, or, it's not, nobody seems to be listening to me or hearing what I'm saying. Like, well, you kind of said that, you were okay, you were fine. Well, I thought we were following through. So keep those wait lists, stay on those wait lists. It's like one of those things where you want to get the support and the help in the moment, but sometimes it's best to have it before that moment happens. So maybe the moment occurs and you're kind of able to regulate, but getting those supports in place, because likely if you're struggling to have that conversation, if they're struggling to manage themselves and their own, getting that support in place whenever it's available, so that it doesn't have to be in the intense moment, but in the moments to work towards it, you're better able to process some of that information outside of those intense situations.
Great. Thank you so much, Dawn. Yeah, I like the expression, in the substance use world, we often hear about slaying the dragon, that you have this demon, you have this struggle, this something that you're so addicted to, this chemical. They call it slaying the dragon. But what I learned in other areas is like with things that you have to use, like relationships, like exercise, like technology and food and all of that, they call it petting the dragon. How do you live with this device that we need? How do you, not use a relationship in an addictive way, and those kinds of things. And we didn't talk a lot about shopping, but, and Bob, thanks to Bob Lamb, who's our, he's our mental health or our public health expert. He did a lot of this research trying to find this information. There wasn't a whole lot out there on some of these areas with regard to adolescence. but, shopping can be an easy one. People joke about retail therapy, right? Like to go shopping, but if you're using it, if you're only happy, if you're ripping the tags off of something, as I actually heard someone say one time, that can be a problem too. And it can, people are so susceptible when, again, Amazon, my God, click, 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 and you've got a basket full of stuff at your fingertips, and like, what, it's not getting here till Tuesday. I mean, we have just totally transformed the way we think about these things, and it's just, we're primed for it right now. And so I worry about a lot of that. But just the awareness is so important, just to kind of being mindful about our behavior, our own behaviors, and recognize, like, I've been sitting in this spot for too many hours, or I'm doing that thing again where this is the only thing that makes me happy. And when the package comes, did that really make you happy, or did it really just feel good when you're hitting the putting in the shopping cart? So I appreciate a couple of the questions that came in while you're speaking, guys. Here's one. Are there any groups available for teens to work through process addictions? It seems that it would be valuable to educate and destigmatize in group settings, much like we do in 12-step programs. There are 12-step programs for these, but Liz or Dawn, do either of you know of any in particular that aren't 12-step programs? Or if you want to talk about those as well, that would be great.
So there are definitely a few different therapy groups that are available for it. And then, yeah, like Kim saying, there are different processing addiction 12-step groups. Those are a little harder to find. They're usually more protected, right? Especially things like SLA, right? Like sex, love, addiction, things like that. So it's usually like there's a couple different numbers online that you would then have to call to be able to access that information. So it's not as accessible as other things might be, but there are definitely resources out there, and I'd be happy to make sure that gets shared if that's something that anyone would ever be interested in.
Great. Yeah, I know there are so many different 12-step programs. And if you're not familiar with 12-step programs, that we're talking about things like Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's just a certain format that's followed and some traditions that are maintained that have to do with, but there can be some very specific ones. I actually saw a list of about 80 different kinds of 12-step programs. So it is that connection, is just as this question implies, it is helpful to be in a group setting when people understand what you're going through. It helps reduce that shame that might be keeping you isolated and from talking about this or addressing it. So being with other people that understand it, I think, is really helpful.
And then another thing is also that the schools are really just about that second part, right? Being valuable, like destigmatizing. I know that the schools around here are also really phenomenal with bringing therapists and different speakers in, where we're able to have really candid conversations with the students so that we can really educate and kind of like open up conversations. Like I was just talking at a high school 2 weeks ago, all 4 years for very different topics, right? Where we can go back each year and just touch base again with them on where they're at with different things in a way where like the teachers kind of step out so that we can, we don't have to be a school saying, just say no and things like that, but really being able to kind of let them have the space to have more vulnerable conversations in like a way that kids might not ever actually have access or end up in a therapeutic setting. They're still able to have that experience.
Great. Bob, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was kind of going to piggyback off of like, we talk a lot about the healthy like coping skills. Are there any like groups, like, I don't know, Dawn, if you see that are for students who may not like, that would promote some of the healthy coping skills that we talk about, to kind of prevent those behaviors from becoming addictions? Just thinking about some of those more protective factors for engagement within the school system.
Program, we do offer support groups. One of the biggest ones that we have a few different groups of is coping techniques and strategies. That can be for any student who is, expressing a need. It's kind of the trend that we're finding more and more kids don't know how to even soothe really. They don't even know what it is to calm themselves down or take a break, take a moment. We hear that mindful techniques, breathing techniques, but they don't really know how to practice them or find ones that work for them. So some of those groups have just been like trying to practice different techniques that you can use during the school day. So that's been something. We definitely have groups around stress management, anger management, definitely family dynamics, sometimes that, and then more and more peer interactions. Social media certainly causes a lot of peer interactions that can, really, we talked about, what is your digital image and what is that putting out there, getting themselves into more and more drama situations. So kind of how do you interact with peers and repair those relationships? So those have been some of the conversations that we have had. Our groups tend to run 6 to 8 weeks, but some of our groups continue throughout the year, depending on the groups of students, their interest in participating. All of our SAP groups are voluntary. So that is, if a student isn't interested or isn't ready to participate in a group setting, we try to offer some one-on-one, but that can be a challenge too, because some of the kids don't want to miss time in school or don't want to, address those concerns while they're in the school setting. So we do hear that a lot. I don't want anybody in school to know what's going on, or I don't really like the group setting. So we really do try to encourage that. COVID switched some of that. We used to be able to offer some like prevention type small group settings at the middle school level for all of our 6th graders, just to experience what a group was like. We had to shift this year and are doing it more in the classroom setting. And then we offer elementary groups that are usually peer, peer interactions and being a good friend, and then kind of managing your emotions. So again, we do offer K through 12 groups. Those can be, if you're having any questions or interest in those, you could just certainly reach out to your school counselors. Some of our kiddos through their IEPs would have services, depending on if it's a goal written in there or not, that maybe they're working with a school psychologist or other behavior specialists. So there are different ways to get group supports in schools. And then we do have a lot of clubs and activities. So some of the clubs do outreach and try to help reduce stigma. One of the clubs that I work with it's called BPOC Club, which originally was about substance abuse and awareness, and has over the past 3 or 4 years shifted more to a mental health focus, and just trying to kind of raise awareness and get some information out. There are other affinity groups and clubs, so there's certainly other ways of getting involved. And our clubs, fortunately, meet during the school day at the high school, so kids don't have to worry about additional transportation or things like that. There's so many avenues for them getting involved. That's a good question. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. And then outside of the school program, right, DBT therapy is really the main therapeutic practice that really shows the best results in terms of addiction, right? So if we're early on, if we're able to get kids into DBT specific groups, right? Like I teach DBT skills, but then there are just specific groups that are pure DBT. It's dialectical behavioral therapy, and it deals with distress tolerance, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, and then mindfulness, like Dawn was talking about. So if a kid isn't comfortable with doing it in school, that is like a very specific type of therapy that outside of a school can be really beneficial for a kid that might be struggling.
That's great. Thank you. There's a question: when do you draw the line and or decide to seek outside help when your teen doesn't want to cooperate or take direction from the parents? And this kind of speaks to some of the other advanced questions that we had that were about what Dawn just described with that meltdown. Someone else asked about how do I approach topics without triggering a blow up or a shutdown? I had a promise not to talk about food we'll talk about food in a second. I'm going to put a pin in that in a second. But when they don't want help, I'm fine. You think this is a problem. I think it's just fine. You're blown out of proportion. This is what everybody does as social norms, right? That we really want to believe to help validate whatever it is that we're doing. Are there ways to Maybe if you want to talk even about motivational interviewing the parents might be able to use, would that be something that would be helpful, do you think, Liz?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, right, like I was saying earlier, kids like feel like they're always like going to be attacked, right? Like anytime that you bring up like any little thing, right, they're already anticipating it coming, right? So you might not know what's going on right under the surface, but if you're bringing it up in like in the car, right, it's like wherever it is, it can happen, right? And it's a matter of also what's being said versus what they're hearing, right? So I've just been working with this family for a period of time, and the kid comes in to me every day so stressed. All my mom does is talk to me about my school. All she cares about is that my grades are perfect, right? She's like, I'm struggling so much with my mental health, and it's the only thing that my mom talks about, right? And then meanwhile, I'm talking to the mom in the parent group, and she's like, I don't care what my kid gets. Like, I don't care about any of these grades. I just know that she's stressed about her grades, so I check in with her about it, right? And so there's just this like direct miscommunication on what is being said, because the mom's just trying to be supportive and the kid is hearing, I need to just get it together and get really good grades, right? And so being able to slow it down, have specific times where these conversations are happening, definitely some motivational interviewing. And then also, you know, you all are the parents at the end of the day, right? And so being able to set some boundaries and things along those lines where it's like, hey, listen, like if this is something that's continuing, we're like, let's look into getting you to talk to somebody, right? And it's okay. It's okay that they think everything's fine, right? Just be like, hey, just like do this and humor me and I'll like leave you alone or whatever, right? Because like we run into this all the time when we're working with kids, right? It's a matter of my kid isn't motivated or my kid isn't doing this or that, right? And the reality is that sometimes like the kids are just have different motivation than what we want them to have, right? And so being able to figure out how to plug into that and find out really what's going on with them can help kind of like set them back on track and give them some space where it's like being really validated that whatever is going on is something that they are running up against at this age.
Yep. Okay, great.
Definitely, I was just gonna say, I've definitely seen that quite a bit, Liz, and I think it's really good. Knowing that the expectations that you have too are within the realm of your child. Sometimes having expectations of them being an A student when being a B student is really already stressful and accommodating. Not every student is going to be able to be an A student. Not every student's going to have great organizational skills. I know that, personally. There are just some things that a personality too cannot always live up to the expectations of. So being realistic with those, are you holding realistic goals for your child? Do they want to be in some of these activities and clubs, or are you just kind of, forcing them in? So making sure that you know what those interests are. I think that was another really good point. Sometimes our kids do things that we want them to do, and they're really not interested, and then they kind of get resentful and kind of back down. But I would say to that question too, if the question is, at what point, if that's the question, then I think you might be at that point, right? Like if you're saying you don't know how to stop the meltdowns or deal with the press, deal with the emotions, it may be time to say, what, we're not having good conversation, and it may be helpful to get supports in place now rather than waiting down the road. The younger that you can work with students and the family dynamic to really kind of hit those concerns and be able to communicate better and learn to live with boundaries and expectations, and knowing what those boundaries are, being able to communicate those boundaries and expectations, I think is key. It can really help the family dynamic as a whole. And the longer you kind of hold off, so it can really kind of just continue to exasperate. But the other piece that I will say in this, no matter what age, is if you say that you're going to do something as the adult in the situation, you have to do that thing. Don't say it if you're not going to do it. Don't say you're going to take away the thing if you're not ready to do that. Don't Don't say that you're going to not let them to go out on the weekend with a friend if this something doesn't happen. You have to maintain that expectation, because if not, then your word isn't as strong as your value. But that's a big one, is making sure that whatever you say you're going to do, you're going to follow through it, or don't say it at all. Credibility is the thing.
That's so important, Dawn. That is such a really good point. I know that when my son was struggling, I didn't want to poke the bear. I didn't want to pick that battle, and that then we would lose our integrity. We would lose that opportunity to, we are the parent, they don't have a lot of opportunities for parents. They've got loads of opportunities for friends, not so many opportunities for parents. We need to be that, in that uncomfortable place that I love what one of our other therapists says. He says, we have to get comfortable seeing our kids be uncomfortable. So yes, making this hard call that this is not going to be okay, because they're going to need to eventually learn to self-regulate, to be, adults and manage this on their own. But until that happens, that is our job sometimes to say, especially in the younger years, to say, no, it's time to stop this now, So I also want to follow up on the one that I just mentioned about food. So again, how do I approach topics without triggering a blow up or a shutdown? Kind of what we were just talking about. I had to promise not to talk about food with my older teen. Liz, can you talk about eating disorders and food, and what talk about walking on eggshells with this one. It's a tricky one.
Absolutely. Eating disorders come with a lot of shame and guilt, right? And so when it's the same as it's the same as all other process addictions or addictions, right? It's like we're looking at the symptoms and not the underlying cause, right? So I have parents that come in, they're like, oh my God, like my kid's cutting, I'm sending her into school, my grandparents saw it, right? Like all of these things, right? And it's not really about like the self-harm, right? It's like what's going on internally. So when we get hyper focused on the specific symptom that's happening, right? Like the eating behavior, it's a quick way to get shut down. And so when sometimes it's like, it's like we call it like the back door, right? It's like sometimes we can't like address it head on, because we'll lose them, right? They don't want to engage in that way. But if we're able to ask them, like, what's going on with you? Like, how was your day? How was school, right? Like, what's going on with your friends, right? And just kind of like showing up to have a conversation with them to kind of see where they're at and validate those things, as opposed to the focus of the eating behavior itself. Because like eating disorders are control, right? Like there's something going on internally that they're not feeling safe or regulated, and they're trying to create that in some way. And it's not really about like their food consumption. It's about helping them find a different way to regulate that piece. Is that fair?
I think so. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's a very tricky one. And please ask for help in all these situations. Well, and the next question we have is any suggestions when your child refuses counseling? And just with regard to that, I was going to say, don't be afraid to seek counseling, because this is not something that we can do on our own. We are not, even if we're a professional who happens to be a social worker, therapist, counselor, psychologist, we're still mom and dad. And that really takes precedence when the child is struggling, to seek professional help whenever possible. So what do you do? And I'm sure, Dawn, you probably have encountered this yourself. What do you do when a child says, I'm not going to see a therapist? That's not my problem.
Book, and there's a lot of support groups out there for families too, and sometimes the parental unit of taking the support yourself and getting, what are the barriers of you not being able to get the child to engage therapy. Sometimes it takes more for you to understand what's going on with you, because mental health really it impacts the family. So it could be one person who maybe is struggling with mental health, but it impacts the family dynamic, it impacts the family. So even if you're getting the support, kind of working at it for yourself until you can engage that child, engage the school. We want to know what's going on as much as we can to support and help. We've had, counselors who are getting kids, they're meeting them out of the car and kind of working to get them in the building during the day. So we're here to support as much as we can. But we need to be part of the conversation to know that we need to help. Any ways that you can engage your outside therapy team with inside school supports, really, really helpful. So if you have them in place, and then sometimes it's asking the question, are they connecting and what are they talking about? I think Liz mentioned it earlier, where sometimes a therapist maybe not have, experience in the concerns or the issues that the child is addressing. So they're not really feeling like they're getting much out of it. So it also has to be something that's, that they're fine by you. Are they connecting with the therapist? Are they, what are some of the barriers to them going? Asking the question, why are you not going? What's holding you back? Is it the time frame? Is it really hearing out their concerns, and validating that, letting them know that you're listening and understanding why, and then also share with them why it's important for you guys to seek therapy together as a family unit to kind of work through whatever problems are happening.
Right. Therapy is such a loving thing to offer. It's not punishment. It's a positive thing. It's a very loving thing to do. And to say, I can't, I think it's perfectly fair for a parent to say, I'm not sure how I can help you. I want to help you, but I'm not able to, like, I need help too. So let's, we're in this together. Let's get help together. Or maybe I'm overreacting. Let's go talk to someone who understands this, who can give you the support that you need and help me to understand it too. So to kind of validate what they're feeling, but also just to be vulnerable yourself and say, like, I can't do this on my own. I really need us to go together, get some help. And another really great question that just came up: what happens when the other parent refuses to attend their family therapy? That's such a huge challenge. Liz, have you encountered this?
All the time. This is so common, right? It's like, I feel like, I work with high school kids, but so much of what I'm actually doing is like really working with the parents, right? And it's really common for parents to come in on two totally different pages when they're working with their kids, when they have concerns about their kids or their own dynamic with one another, when that gets stressed because of what's going on at home, right? Everybody's coming into a marriage, into a family with their own lived experience, right? Their own way that they were raised. And so often it's one parent is like, something needs to be done about this right now. And the other parent is like, he's in high school. It's fine. Like, we'll let it go. Like, I used to do these things. Right. And really trying to work with the parents together to get them on a closer page. Sometimes what happens is I just meet with dad for a couple of months, or I just meet with mom, right? Whoever the parent is that's kind of coming in. And like the beautiful thing about doing therapy, right, is that even if that other person is not in the room engaging in therapy, if you're working with a good therapist and they're helping you to identify your own patterns and help you set healthier boundaries, that even if that other person is not coming into the therapy office, that there can still be changes that are happening at home based on the work that you're doing, which usually helps kind of pave a path to get the rest of the family engaged.
Yep. Thank you.
And one thing to talk on that, like refusing to go to therapy. I know when I was in high school and my parents were like, you have to go to therapy. I thought, I was taking the blame for all of like the things that were going on in my life and really didn't see them as issues. But once it eventually became apparent to me, I had some place to go. Like, I had someone to talk to. And, the first therapist I went to, like, wasn't a great fit, but I at least like knew what the systems were like, so I could feel comfortable when I did find that right therapist that would eventually help me through that. So I don't know if that's like the right way to go about it, but like I had no desire to go to therapy when I was like 17 years old. But it eventually became a great tool. And I knew it was something that my parents were willing to invest their time in and driving me. So there was some value that ultimately came down to it in the long run.
Absolutely. I mean, that's huge, right? It's like, so when kids are coming in, right, it's like, they're like the identified patient, right? It's like kids come in and it's like, fix my kid, right? My kid is doing this, my kid is doing that, right? And a lot of what I do is really working to like build rapport with these kids and then find something that I can have you guys budge on a little bit so that they can see that I have their back, right? And that it's a whole family piece and not just them. And that helps them also like create that buy-in as well, once you guys are engaged and able to like work within that as well. Because then once I can like be like, all right, well, like mom will let your curfew be 45 minutes later so you can like go to the movie or whatever with your friends, right? Then I can come back and also challenge them on some of their behaviors as well. And having them not feel like the like identified client anymore.
Right. And I think just to Bob's point too, it's like not all kids are very comfortable with emotional vocabulary, like naming their feelings and talking about their feelings. So I think if there are opportunities to talk about feelings that aren't related to whatever the challenge is, whatever the issue is that we're worrying about, but like, you know, getting, it's a part of our like earlier prevention for parents of younger kids, where we have this list of emotional vocabulary words that you can just slap on the refrigerator and just like say, pick a word and tell me what that means to you. Like, what does it mean to feel overwhelmed? What does it mean to feel, melancholy, whatever it might be, or positive words too, you know, uplifting feelings, but to just name them and talk about them and say, what does that mean to you? And to also, again, to validate things. So when you hear your child say, I'm worried about something, as a parent, our knee-jerk reaction is to say, don't worry, because that's making me uncomfortable that you're worried. So we kind of shut that down. But if we say like, okay, well, let's talk about that. What does that feel like for you to be worried? And what would help you to feel less worried? Or what have you done in the past when you were worried? Things like that, just to allow that and give space and respect to it. And I also saw a question I thought was good about amotivational. And I know that this is something that comes up a lot in this post-COVID or in COVID world, whatever we're in right now, with school refusal. And it's a little off topic, but I think it's an important one. But you know, how do both of you, Liz and Dawn, deal with that amotivational stuff with schools almost like an option, it feels like, for some kids these days? Are you seeing that a lot still, Dawn, or is it getting a little better?
It's getting better. I think that COVID has certainly shifted kind of what we modeled for students. They didn't have to be present all the time, and they were still maintaining grades. They didn't have to come every day, and we were really lax on attendance. And this was across the board, not just in this district. There are many other districts who are seeing the same thing, where we taught children that they had some flexibility. And this is something that we're trying to reteach kids, right? Like, you do need to be present in order to get the grade, and you do need to hear the lesson to be able to do the work. And so I know some people are like, can't blame COVID forever, but it shifted some expectations and things that we have to be aware of, and we have to acknowledge them to be able to change them, right? So there were definitely some shifts that occurred, and it impacted our youth and what they saw, because things were different. Because we all decided to give grace and allow for whatever we needed to do, but now we're like, okay, now you got to get back on track, and you have to be ready to be engaged and be learning. So yes, we're definitely seeing that it's gotten better, but there still are some lasting effects of that. And just even like behavior responses and how students see the urgency to things, or see the need, like, well, I'm going to get it done when I get it done. When we're kind of trying to head back to like, there are deadlines, and there are, things that you have to do in a timely manner. And this impacts you in the real world and when you get out of school, So for us, it's kind of acknowledging the behaviors when they're coming up, and working really a little bit student to student, and trying to help them to organize, help them to focus on different tasks and break them down as we need to. Because it is a little bit individualized at this point, really. Is it what are the barriers to them? Is it the social interactions? There's too many people. Is it the subject matter? Is it that sitting in periods for too long, they're just, I can't sit here anymore. So trying to figure out what barriers for each individual student, as we've seen them, kind of more individualized than the whole student body, right? Like, was it a big adjustment for everybody? And now it's kind of some of those lingering things that we're, definitely dealing with. And we saw some in the beginning of the year that have got improved, and they're, kind of worked through some of those things. And now we're starting to see some more towards the end of the year. Not really exactly understanding what the shift was, but trying to figure out how do we support whatever anxiety is kind of presenting at the moment. Was it a situation? So was it peer interaction? Was it different class? Was it and just really kind of work with that? But again, that's something at the school, if we don't know that it's an issue, we can't really address it. So again, communicating when you can is really, really helpful for us.
Great, thanks. Yeah. Any thoughts on, Liz, on school refusal or motivation in general?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of school refusal with my kids, right? I feel like I'm getting regular emails from parents being like, I need you to write another absent note, right? And I spent a lot of time on the phone with a few of like the middle schools, right? And having to like sit on my computer for a year when I was like 30 is like very different than like stopping like a 7th grader from going to school and like completely like abrupting what their education looks like, and then all of a sudden just putting them back in school as like freshmen in high school, right? So again, like the idea that how we know how things go and what we want these kids' motivation to be versus what their lived experience has been is very different, right? It's like, I always went to school, right? Like we were physically in school, I played sports, we did all these things, right? But that's not necessarily what these kids' experience has been. And their mental health deteriorated because of it. And then we threw them back in school. And the idea of having to re-socialize and deal with anxiety and get back into the swing of school has been a slow process for them. And so being able to like Dawn's saying, right, give the grace to like get them back in and then also like slowly build that up. But yeah, I mean, it's across the board. What I'm seeing with these kids is anxiety over things that don't seem that big to parents, right? Or to me or to school, right? But things that they're really getting tripped up on. And so being able to really, really slow it down and like get to the bottom of it, right? Like having kids that don't remember what their passwords are, don't remember how to get to like a certain classroom or physically do something in a way that like they didn't have to do while they were on the computer will like derail them from going to school for a week. And so just being able to work on things like that with them.
I put in there too, some of the, you mentioned one that there was like, sometimes it's okay to be uncomfortable. I think what we're also seeing though is some parents, as soon as the student's like, I don't want to, or I can't do it right now, they're like, well, then you don't have to, and it's okay. Where again, it's like, well, we have to, resiliency is a skill, right? Resiliency is something that you have to practice at, and sometimes you feel uncomfortable before you can be resilient and see the purpose. And the more you kind of enable, so sometimes it's a balance of whether are we truly holding them something from a child or holding back a child from something they feel anxious about, or is it something they just kind of feel uncomfortable about, and now we're building a pattern for them where it becomes harder and harder the longer you're away from something to continue, like, okay, I'm missing school, and it's really just because the kid was like able to stay home, not really like you saying like, oh, I'm feeling, I don't want to go in. They're like, okay, well, you don't have to, and then allowing that to happen for a period of time. Now the student's even more behind, and we miss a period of time, and then the anxiety is really, increased because they are behind in classwork. They have a lot of assignments due, and how do we kind of manage that? So there is a balance of like, is it something that we have to push through? Can we work through, and how do we modify as we need to? Because it can't just be a complete, elimination of school, right? Like we want our kids to go to school. We want our kids to, learn and be able to continue on in life versus shutting down and not not moving through those uncomfortable situations. And really, even having anxiety is something that you manage, it's something that you work through, not just stop. So if you're finding those barriers, it needs to be like, how are we working through it? How are we, moving to support you in it versus just saying, okay, we're just going to acknowledge the anxiety.
Right. Thanks so much. Boy, a lot of great information. Thank you all so much for this conversation. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. Last call for any questions that you all might have. Don't see anything in the Q&A. Oh, thanks, Bob. There's the survey for tonight's program. And then all those follow-ups, the calendar, our YouTube channel, the parent partnership meetings, family recovery course. And then I also put in there the follow-up page, that conversation.zone/addiction. That's where the recording of this program will be. Probably by morning, it should be ready, finished processing. Liz and Dawn, thank you both so much. Dawn, thanks for having us. And Liz, thanks for all your expertise and insights. And thank you all for being with us.
Yep, you guys being here is the most important piece. Without these conversations, we can't make change and make difference. So thank you. And thank you again to Hatboro-Horsham Education Foundation, our school board, for letting us have these fun conversations and bringing the real conversations forward in the community and talking about them. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.